Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the second event in our speaker series on global digital rights challenges, brought to you by the Promise Institute for Human Rights and the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. My name is Michael Karen-Nicholas. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy, which is a new research center at UCLA, whose mission is to foster research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable. The Promise Institute for Human Rights is the center of human rights education, research, and advocacy at UCLA, which empowers students with enriching teaching and experiential opportunities in human rights law, engages with diverse frameworks and disciplines to generate new thinking on human rights, and advocates for change in coalition with academics, practitioners, and activists. They focus their work on 5 main thematic areas: migration, race, the environment, accountability, and technology. I'll begin at the outset with an acknowledgement on behalf of both of our institutes, UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva people. We are very excited today to welcome Marwa Fatafta, the Middle East Policy Manager for Access Now, who leads their work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region. She is an advisory board member of the Palestinian digital rights organization Hamle and a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian policy network working on issues of political leadership, governance, and accountability. Before joining Access Now, Marwa worked as the MENA regional advisor at Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin and coordinated regional and global efforts to mainstream gender into anti-corruption policies and norms. She previously served as a communications manager at the British Consulate General in Jerusalem and was a Fulbright Scholar to the US and holds an MA in International Relations from Syracuse University and an MA in Development and Governance from the University of Duisburg-Essen. She will be speaking today with Jess Peak, the Assistant Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and Director of the International and Comparative Law Program at UCLA School of Law. Jess has taught classes on international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and methods and theories of international and comparative law. In December, she received a grant from the UC Multi-Campus Project and Initiatives to launch a human rights digital investigations lab at the Promise Institute in collaboration with colleagues at UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz. The lab launched successfully this January and has already trained 25 students in cutting-edge open source investigation technology. This summer, Jess is supervising 3 full-time student fellows who are working on a report examining the role that online disinformation played in the fall 2020 conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Jess, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and welcome everybody, and welcome Marwa. I'm delighted to see so many people here. Marwa, I thought we maybe would start off with kind of a landscape setting question, which is, can you describe a little bit how social media has become an important tool for activists and change makers in the Middle East, North Africa region? And what are some of the most used platforms there that we need to be concerned about?
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Michael, for the introductions and for the audience for joining us today. It's a great question because the MENA region has one of the worst world records on freedom of expression. The information ecosystem is heavily controlled by the state, and it has been traditionally controlled by the state. So it's been really hard for journalists, activists, human rights defenders, civil society at large, or even ordinary citizens to really express their opinions, to share information, to communicate freely and safely with each other, let alone, of course, when it comes to political organizing and mobilization. It's been extremely difficult. And with the advent of social media, and here I want to go back to a moment, historical moment in time, a decade ago. I mean, this year we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, or the Arab uprisings back in 2011, where there was this moment of celebration of the so-called liberation tech, that social media platforms had finally liberated that heavily controlled information system and has allowed people to communicate with each other freely, to also expose corruption and human rights violations by oppressive regimes in the region, which have been heavily not only controlled, but also suppressed, actively suppressed and hidden from being disseminated. And so 10 years forward, of course, social media companies still, or platforms, sorry, still play that pivotal role, that crucial role, where as a citizen, you can still express yourself, mobilize. There are many social movements and political movements, whether political or social. You know, the Me Too movement, for example, has made its way to the MENA region, where women, until this point in time, are exposing sexual assault, sexual harassment, and supporting each other on social media. But unfortunately, that space is becoming also policed and controlled both by the state on the one hand, but also by these content moderation policies from social media companies. And that's why I'm extremely excited to be speaking with you today about how those policies and actions play out in a region like the MENA region.
Thank you. And sorry, before I move on, I should say, for anybody that has questions, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A. We can do those throughout. There'll also be a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So if you want to raise your hand during that time, we'd love to have your questions then as well. So returning, Marwa, to what you were just saying. So are we talking about all social media platforms, or are there particularly prominent ones that sort of stand out as being very heavily utilized in the region? And also, we were just talking earlier about social media really being the internet. And so I was hoping you could also talk a little bit about what that means for people in the region.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the most popular platforms, Facebook it really depends on where you are in the MENA region, I should say that. So for countries like Jordan, Palestine, the majority of North African countries, I think Facebook is the most popular platform used by internet users. In the Gulf region, you have Twitter being the top used platform. So you see more activists from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and different parts of the Gulf region using Twitter most actively as opposed to Facebook. But then we've also seen recently that Instagram is being utilized more and more for political campaigning, which is definitely something we've seen in recent years. YouTube as well, especially for human rights documentation. There's a lot of videos and content, for example, coming from Syria, documenting war crimes and human rights violations. So it really depends on what you're using that platform for. In terms of newcomers, TikTok is becoming the new star now, and especially during the COVID-19 period, and in in countries like Egypt, we see that the app is being used extremely widely, but that also brings in new challenges for users. Last year, there was at least 9 young women who are TikTok influencers who unfortunately were detained and prosecuted by the Egyptian public prosecutor for violating family values. They were just sharing benign content of lip syncing, singing, and some makeup tutorials and whatnot. But according to the cybercrime legislation, or according to the public prosecutor, that was in violation of the cybercrime law. And this is one example of how new platforms that come up and utilized by users in different ways, both political and non-political, can be easily or quickly cracked on by governments in the region.
Thank you. So we're here today to talk about content moderation and particularly how American companies regulating content can be problematic. But before we get into the meat of that, can you explain to us what we mean by content moderation? Like, who is doing it? How is it being regulated? What sort of activities are being captured by these policies?
I mean, I must admit that I never thought about this question, so I don't have a smart definition of what content moderation is, but in simple terms, I think it's a practice by social media companies to look at user-generated content to determine whether that content is in line with their terms of services, rules, or community standards. And so in a nutshell, it's social media companies deciding what is permissible and what is not on their platforms. And obviously this is a source of contention, because who gets to decide and develop those rules of what is legitimate speech and what is not, or what is legitimate content and what is not? And so far, I think social media companies have enjoyed a form of self-regulation in terms of what we call at Access Now content governance, because it's not only about looking at the content and deciding whether you want to keep it or remove it, but it's also about boosting and promoting that content or demoting it, among other issues. And in that content governance model, platforms themselves develop their own policies and their own rules and their own terms of services to decide, what is permissible and what is not. And in many cases, that is not necessarily in line with international human rights standards, and results in violating the user's rights, despite of public commitments by social media companies to adhere and respect human rights. And again, it's sometimes also not in line with national laws, which is a good thing, in fact, because if you, as a company, social media company, want to develop your own rules based on, I don't know, the laws of China or the laws of Turkey or the laws of Saudi Arabia, that means a lot of censorship. But they do adhere to or comply with US laws. And whereas, as I understand, that has implications on particular sort of content, especially when it comes to extremism and violent content. And we can talk about this later today when we talk about what's the impact of US-based companies moderating content in the global South or in the rest of the world, where definitely US laws can be problematic for legitimate speech elsewhere in the world.
So it sounds like that these platforms have an enormous amount of power to make decisions about what speech is legitimate versus what speech is not legitimate. And you mentioned that that the companies are sort of developing their own internal policies around this, not really guided by any particular external framework. And you mentioned obviously just now that many of the large companies that we're talking about are US based, and so they are, at least in some respects, operating within the US legal framework at least. But what about human rights? And you mentioned human rights at the beginning of your previous answer. How do some of these platform content moderation policies impact human rights? What are some of the concerns that are raised? And how should platforms be thinking about human rights as a more useful framework that they should really be seeking to incorporate in their policies?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and also a difficult one, because there has been a lot of debate around how to incorporate international human rights law and standards into content moderation policies, and the entire governance of speech and how those companies make decisions around content. In terms of, so there are two parts to this question. Obviously, the impact of content moderation policies on human rights. And I think in the MENA region, at least, we have been documenting for a long time, and especially since the Arab Spring, a lot of discrimination and arbitrary decision and non-transparent decision-making when it comes to Arabic content or content coming from the region at large, whether Arabic or English. And I think just the fact that, if you are a user relying on social media, if you're relying on Facebook for your livelihood, for your job, for your work, if you're an artist and a musician, or if you're an activist or a human rights defender, and as you said, like for those people, sometimes the social media platforms is the internet, because that's the only space where you can express yourself. Because otherwise, if you're a journalist and in Egypt right now, it's impossible to publish an article in a state-run media or any media, as a matter of fact, that is affiliated by the regime. And for those who are still running as independent media outlets, they are blocked. Their websites are blocked and are prosecuted, they're detained, and etc. So you're facing a lot of intimidation, you're facing a lot of harassment, and the only place for you to share information, to publish article, to talk to people, to document is social media. And therefore, when you wake up one day and your account is suspended, and that had happened many times, that's a violation of your right to freedom of expression. When Twitter, for example, decides around a particularly important political moment back in late 2019, when there were calls for anti-Sisi, which is the president of Egypt, protests, Twitter decided that a particular expression of political dissent was against their rules and against the rules, and they were deleting and suspending accounts of prominent Egyptian activists. That's a violation of their freedom of expression and also the right to association and assembly online. And unfortunately, in those cases, there's no transparency, so you don't know what rules or terms of services you've violated as a user, and most importantly, you don't have access to remedy, and you don't know how to challenge that decision. And often here comes the role of organizations like Access Now, that we have a running helpline that provides digital security support and can communicate and escalate cases to social media companies for them to take a quick action. But unfortunately, not everyone has access to an organization like Access Now. And as a result of that, you're being censored, you're being silenced, and you can't express yourself, especially around political moments. And we see this in Syria. We saw this most recently in Palestine, where activists were organizing politically, and Instagram and Facebook were censoring their content on a mass scale. Like thousands of content has been removed. And to just borrow the words of one activist on the ground, if it wasn't for their live streaming on Instagram, they would have been attacked by the police and dragged out of their homes. So sometimes your ability to go on those platforms, either through live streaming or through sharing content, can create kind of a buffer zone or a form of protection for you, especially when you are on the front lines. And this is where social media companies fail quite miserably, I have to say, in not protecting their users and not protecting their users' rights. Like if your account is being suspended at this one particular important moment, it raises, of course, a lot of questions about who makes decisions and how, and obviously questions around content moderation at scale, about algorithms that are used by those platforms to moderate content, and so on and so forth. Not to mention, of course, how you develop certain policies and how do you decide that, as in the example I shared with you with Twitter, that one particular word of political dissent is hate speech. And that leads me to the second part of your question. Things like hate speech, incitement to violence, terrorism, those are categories of speech that are broad, but don't have any universal definitions. And definitely the international human rights standards don't also provide any specific definitions. But then we see that social media companies are developing their own definitions of what constitutes hate speech and what constitutes incitement to violence and what constitutes terrorism. And in some particular cases, those decisions are heavily politicized. We can see that they're taking cues or from governments, or they're being pressured by governments to moderate or over-moderate certain content. And this is where we try to always bring back the conversation of the importance of human rights standards to set at least certain limitations and restrictions on censorship and on removal of content, and that it requires a higher threshold. We need higher thresholds, especially on their decisions that are disproportionate, unnecessary, and most often, you know, they're not even legitimate. They lack legitimacy. But again, you know, the conversation around human rights framework, like personally, I'm still trying to crack that formula, if you may, of how exactly can we incorporate human rights standards into content moderation policies. But for now, as a start, we can say that we just need to learn what these content moderation policies are, because in my part of the world, the policies that govern speech of users here is in many cases opaque. They're policies that we learn about either through trial and error, through experience, that when you think, certain content is absolutely over moderated, or through private consultations with the companies that we learn, okay, so you do have a rule for this, but you don't share it with your users, and you don't share it on your platform. So transparency is extremely important at this point, and as a starting point.
There's a tremendous amount to unpack in there, Marwa. Maybe, I know that Access Now about a year ago adopted a set of recommendations for content governance that does encourage respect for human rights. So could you maybe talk a little bit, talk us through some of those recommendations? Obviously, we don't have time to go through all 26, but like, what are some immediate or incremental changes that platforms could make now that would sort of move in the direction of greater protection of human rights of users?
Yeah, so the 26 recommendations you mentioned, we developed them in a report on content governance, where we established three sort of systems. One is self-regulation, which is the current system we have with social media companies. They develop their own rules and they implement them, often without transparency and without accountability. Then we have the state regulation. It's when states are, through their own national legislation and frameworks, deciding what content is constituted as illegal content and what is not. And obviously in a repressive or authoritarian context, that has severe ramifications on human rights. And then there is this combined co-regulation system where companies have the ability to regulate their own content, but also that governments have or provide also their own regulation. But in terms of recommendations and what needs to change now, I had mentioned to you in our prep call, we've been working quite actively on a recent case in Palestine, and that to me summarizes the problems we've been facing on social media platforms in the MENA region for over a decade, where, as I said, there has been a lot of discrimination, arbitrary decision-making, and lack of transparency and remedy to users. The case in a nutshell is, as I said, you know, there was a political moment where people are actively sharing documentation of human rights violations, they're organizing and they're sharing content, etc. And we've seen there was this massive censorship, and without users knowing what exactly have they violated and why their accounts are being suspended, why their accounts are, why their content is being taken down. And we are making demands right now to Facebook, but also to other social media companies to provide transparency on the policies that govern speech in the MENA region, because we know there are special policies that exist, but users, ordinary users, and the public at large don't know what these policies are. And we need also transparency on how social media platforms use algorithms to moderate content. And that's, another issue on its own, where because of the huge volume of content, social media platforms have been increasingly relying on automated decision-making and on algorithms to detect and flag and remove content automatically. And with COVID-19 and many human content moderators basically having to work from home, or having to be home now, social media companies are relying more and more on those algorithms. And because speech is very complicated and not straightforward, and especially when it comes to political speech, and from the region, Arabic language that is already difficult and complex, because you have standard Arabic, you have spoken Arabic in different dialects across 22 MENA countries. And in order for the system to flag or to understand, for Facebook or any other social media companies to moderate content, they really need to understand whether the intention of the speaker, the political, social, cultural, linguistic context of that particular piece, in order to determine whether it's really hate speech or not. Whether you are praising terrorism or you are a journalist reporting about a terrorist organization. And those algorithms are absolutely blind and don't understand that nuance and don't understand the complexity of speech. But they're used, and as a result of that use, and as a result of their inability to understand local context, there's many users being affected, either through content being removed or their accounts being suspended in an arbitrary manner. And so we're demanding transparency on those algorithms. When are they being used? And also to be able to know what they are, and to be able to provide some public audits, for example, to understand whether they're working or not. And when it comes to also algorithms, what we are demanding is providing a clear path and process for remedy. So when your content is being taken down as a result of the algorithm and it's a false positive, and by the way, many of the content we escalate to social media companies is removed by error. So is flagged as false positive and then reinstated. So when that happens, we're asking for a second review by a human, by a person who can understand context, especially a person who is from that region or is a specialist on the region that can understand whether this content is indeed in violation of terms of services or not. Unfortunately, right now, as I said, content or accounts are being suspended by the hundreds, by the thousands, and the answer we receive from social media companies is, oops, it was a technical error. And it's been like that, as I said, for the last decade of, sorry, it was a technical error, we'll do better. And then until the next scandal, until the next case. And I think at this point, there needs to be a structural changes within those companies of how they make those decisions and how they design their algorithms as well. And last but not least is, when you develop content moderation policies, you need to co-design them with the communities that are affected by such policies. As I said, right now, we really learn about content moderation policies in such an arbitrary manner. We're sometimes called in for a consultation. And again, we're privileged. Not everybody is a digital rights organization with an access to those big platforms. So sometimes we're called in for a consultation after the policy has been implemented and there are some grievances and maybe they want to add to it, maybe they want to change some bits of it. And sometimes before they embark on developing that policy. So we're pulled in at different points in the policy cycle. And what we're asking for is that, okay, you want to govern speech of communities and populations around the world, sit down with them, talk to them, listen to them, understand their needs, understand how they express themselves, because maybe hate speech for one community is one thing, but to the other, it's legitimate political speech. And in order for you to get it right as a company, there's no other way. You have to speak with civil society organizations, with activists, with human rights organizations that can provide context and can provide not only context, but also can provide cases of how the existing policies cause harm and human rights violations. So there's a wealth of information and experience, and what is lacking, I would say, is the political will of platforms to do that and to dedicate their resources, both technical and financial, and also human resources to do these kind of consultations.
Thank you, Marwa. I mean, yeah, obviously the importance of understanding context can really not be understated here, and the need for particularly affected communities to be integrated into conversations about how policy should be developed by these platforms really seems to be a crucial next step in improving transparency and access and accountability in these platforms. I know that in December, your organization, Access Now, along with about 25 other organizations, sent a letter, an open letter, to Facebook, Twitter, and I think YouTube, calling on them to stop silencing and erasing critical voices from marginalized and oppressed communities across the MENA region. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the circumstances that led to that letter, and also some of the specifics about particular harms that marginalized communities face in content moderation decisions from platforms.
Yeah, we sent that letter on the 17th of December, which was the date on which the Tunisian street vendor Bouazizi set himself on fire, sparking the Arab uprisings. And as you know, or as you remember, the Arab Spring was, as I said, like it was that moment where we all naively celebrated the power of technology and the power of social media, and everyone can speak freely, etc., etc. And I'm not gonna shy away from saying that obviously the Arab uprisings provided a brilliant PR moment for companies like Facebook and Twitter to promote themselves as the platforms that are providing the voice to all people, and where users can express themselves freely and safely and so on. And even though companies claim that their terms of services and their rules are treating their users around the world quite equally, it's our experience working with human rights defenders and activists on the ground speak differently to that. And we've, through our helpline that I mentioned, or through the policy work, we've come across again and again the same grievance from activists, that those companies really don't care about us. I can give you many examples. Syria, for example, tens of thousands of accounts of anti-regime activists, journalists have been suspended without any explanation. In Palestine, same story. Journalists and activists' accounts being suspended without any transparency or notification. In Tunisia last year, hundreds of accounts, people just tried to log in one morning to their accounts and they've been told, you're not eligible to use the platform anymore. And back then we wrote Facebook immediately, what is happening here? Can you give us more information? And they didn't. They just said, sorry, it was a technical mistake, so we're going to reinstate the account. And by the way, until today, there are still accounts that have not been instated or reinstated. And then a week later, we understood, or like we read the news that Facebook has been disrupted a network of what they call inauthentic, coordinated inauthentic behavior. So it was a Tunisian digital company called Your Reputation that was running those sophisticated disinformation campaign to influence presidential and general elections in Tunisia back in 2019 and other African countries. They detected that, they removed the entire network and what they call assets, including accounts and pages and so on. And as a result of that, there was that collateral damage, people that had no link whatsoever to that particular network or company. And then again, we said we want transparency. And obviously, those individuals did not have any way to challenge this decision. There was no way for you to appeal that and say, sorry, I have no connection whatsoever with that company. But ironically, actually, a year before that, we also, as civil society organizations in Tunisia, we asked Facebook to provide transparency ahead of elections, specifically because we were afraid of those disinformation campaigns. And we heard zero answer. A year later, there was that indeed, and ordinary users were affected. The examples are really plenty. And we thought, okay, so this is not just a one-off incident, clearly. There's a system, there's a pattern. And as long as we can't afford as civil society organizations with limited resources to continue to play this game of there's a fire, we need to put it off, and by communicating by those companies. And then the next month or the year after, we have the same exact issue, but in a different country and in a slightly different context. And so we try to analyze the patterns of those content moderation decisions. And in that letter, we demanded transparency on, again, same demands. And I know that I'm repeating myself, but that's the fault of companies, because none of the demands have been answered yet. They're the same demands from many years ago: transparency on your policies, transparency on your actions, remedy to users, and also in conflict areas, obviously, where there is a need for documentation of human rights abuses, there is special policies that recognize that and understand that and can differentiate, a documentation of human rights abuses versus incitement to violence, video or content, and to treat journalistic content with more care and to be able to differentiate. And in that case, of course, you can't rely on algorithm to do this job for you. So that's it in a nutshell. And as I said, and again, last month we released similar demands to Facebook again. So I hope there would be some response or more positive response from them soon.
Thank you. So, I mean, yeah, you keep coming back to this point of transparency, but it really is sort of the crux of this issue. In order to be able to judge content moderation policies and to be able to challenge them, we really need to understand what they are. And it just seems like there is no real ability to understand the basis on which these platforms are making decisions. I think that gives us an opening to talk about the Facebook Oversight Board, which I'll come to in a second. But before we do that, there's actually a really interesting question in the chat from one of my current summer fellows, Nick Levson, who is a rising 3L at UCLA Law School. And he asks, is the goal a catch-all uniform content moderation policy, or is it more of a dynamic, fine-grained collage of policies that take into account particular geopolitical contexts and regions?
I think the idea here is that the policies that govern content obviously are dynamic, because language and expression is by its very nature is also dynamic. And I don't think that a catch-all, one-size-fit-all policy works. It's what is currently being done. And then again, when we see how it's being enforced in our region, there is either over-enforcement and over-moderation, or lack of enforcement and lack of moderation. So anything related to extremism, violence, incitement to violence, that is heavily over-moderated, resulting in, censoring people who should not be censored, especially activists and journalists. But then when we talk about gender-based violence online on those platforms, hate speech targeting gender minorities, there are crickets, literally. Very slow responses by those platforms, and unfortunately, in some cases, leading to real-world harm, where, community members, LGBT community members are being outed on those platforms and their pictures being circulated. And as a result of that, they're being beaten on the streets or kicked out by their families because they found out that their son is gay, for example, or their daughter is gay. And many heartbreaking stories, women activists being intimidated and harassed and threatened on those platforms, and the responses from social media companies are below satisfactory. And so this model, I think, it doesn't work, but what works, or what we aspire to have, is a more decentralized form of content moderation, where users have more control and agency in deciding, how their platform should look like and how they should express themselves. Because at the end of the day, one of key grievance here, and I hear that time and time and time again, who decides that my speech is not permissible? And when you're a part of a community and you have certain political lexicon or social lexicon, and that is accepted among that particular community, why should a US company based in the Silicon Valley decide that actually, no, it's not, your speech is incitement to violence, your speech is hate speech, and therefore it should be deleted and removed? And this is where, again, I'm stressing on this point of co-design, because this one-size-fits-all has failed, and the alternative to that is more, I think, decentralized approach to content moderation.
And do we see any receptiveness of platforms to that idea of co-regulation? Another question in the chat from my student, Nick, again, wonders if there's a difference between how more well-established platforms are approaching this question versus startup platforms. Like, are companies that are new to this space thinking about these issues in a different way?
Good question. I mean, one new app, for example, a social media app, is Clubhouse, and we don't hear much about content moderation in relation to that application. And I just remembered, to your first question, Jessica, it's also becoming extremely popular, especially among communities that where freedom of expression is not allowed. So we see a lot of interesting taboo topics being discussed around sexuality and feminism and anti-regime political discussions and so on. I'm not sure if those applications, for example, are learning the lessons, from other bigger ones. But that's an interesting one. So far, I have not seen, for example, Clubhouse thinking about moderating content differently. And obviously, the medium of that platform, it's audio messages. It's different from Facebook, so I guess it's also different, a different issue. But TikTok, for example, same problems. New platform, same problems. Arbitrary takedowns, arbitrary suspensions, no transparency, no remedy, and so on. And in terms of, how receptive they are to the idea, here's the thing, like, I don't want to be bashing those platforms, right? They do reach out and they try to speak to communities on the ground, for sure. They have been present, especially Facebook and Twitter. But then again, what happens after those conversations, right? How do those conversations translate into structural changes, into actual policies? And this is a missing piece. And we're still hoping for companies to amend that bit, because consultations do happen, but they rarely revert back on their decisions. For example, once they've consulted the community on a certain piece of policy. Yeah, there's a lot to aspire or to desire on that front, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so you've mentioned several times, Marwa, obviously lack of transparency, but also lack of access to remedy. And so I wanted to just spend a few minutes just talking about the Facebook Oversight Board and other entities like that have been put in place to be some type of remedy, right, in a limited range of cases. So what sort of scope do you see bodies like the Oversight Board having, and the type of impact that they might be able to have in content moderation decisions?
Yeah, so when the Oversight Board was announced, we were a bit skeptical. The whole idea of Facebook Supreme Court, again, in my opinion, it's another way for Facebook to keep the self-regulation going. It's very convenient for them, obviously, and so they think, okay, there are a lot of problems with our content moderation. There's a lot of grievance, so let us solve it, through the Oversight Board. And we also raised concerns about regional representation. Again, those are US-based companies, but I think up to 90% of their users are from outside of the US. And when we looked at the first makeup and the first members of the Oversight Board, for example, from the MENA region, it was disappointing, both in terms of the types of members. I don't want to go into details, but regional representation was a big gap. There's a big gap there. But to be fair, I think the Oversight Board, especially with the cases that have been taken, have pushed for quite strongly for some of the stuff that we were asking for. So I think, providing transparency on their dangerous individuals and organizations, for example, that's something we have been calling for ourselves. Many of the political organizations in the region, or some of them, are on that list, on the dangerous individuals and organizations list, and but that list isn't public, and the Oversight Board has been calling for making that public. They've been calling for really positive reforms, so that's a good thing. And I know that there's a new case from the MENA region that the Oversight Board has just announced, and I'm really looking forward to that one, because I think it's about time for the board to tackle issues from the MENA region. So it's, in a nutshell, sorry, I've been going around, but in a nutshell, it's great, the work that they're doing, it's great. They have great experts, especially international human rights lawyers. Nevertheless, the Oversight Board is not the answer. The issues are far bigger than what the Oversight Board can do and accomplish. And not to mention, of course, the usual expression that it's not only about content moderation, but the entire business model is problematic of those companies. And that's something that is obviously outside of the mandate of the Oversight Board.
So we have about 10 minutes left. So I really want to encourage any of our audience that have questions to either raise their hands or to put them in the chat, so we can make sure we can address all the issues that you're interested in hearing from Marwa on today. Oh, actually, Chuka just added a question about a very recently deleted tweet that Twitter removed, that was made by the Nigerian government on the grounds that it incited violence. And the obviously immediate reaction was the banning of Twitter in Nigeria. Do you think that social media companies should be able to regulate speech by government?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, we've seen in the case of the former US President Trump and the results of his speech, and many other officials and politicians who enjoy huge following on those platforms, and they have an audience that listens to them and influenced by their speech, who are disseminating hate speech and all sorts of harmful content. Here, it's not in relation to the Nigerian government's tweet, but to the question whether social media companies should moderate or regulate speech by government. Now, to the ban itself, unfortunately, I think that's a new trend. We've seen it in India and now in Nigeria and Turkey with their social media bill as well, where they require companies to hire a local rep and to respond to their requests for content removal, among other things. So governments are, you know, weaponizing their own legislation and their own power to literally just shut down the platform when it takes decisions disliked by those governments. And that's a very worrying trend. And it's interesting how Twitter, for example, in this case, has been reacting, and also in India. But it's really worrying to me. And so far in the MENA region, we haven't seen governments shutting down particular platforms. But we know when it comes to internet regulation, there's a lot of copy and paste in between different jurisdictions. So if that happens in Nigeria or in India, it would happen in, I don't know, Tunisia or Egypt or Saudi Arabia or any other country for that matter.
And you just mentioned the Turkey social media bill, which does sort of set a number of conditions on social media companies that you just mentioned as well. Are there other examples of states in the MENA region that have imposed obligations under local law for companies to take down specific types of content?
Yeah, there has been. So far in the region, when it comes to internet regulation, there are these cybercrime legislation that prosecutes users based on, those legislations are very repressive, they're ambiguous, overbroad, and many of the provisions basically allow the government to interpret speech however they like. But they wouldn't necessarily obligate social media companies, for example, to take down content, as in the case of the German NetzDG, where you have a certain time frame and you are obligated to take down content if it's considered illegal in that certain country. We've seen attempts last year by Tunisia. They introduced so-called anti-fake news law, which would obligate, which would moderate content on social media platforms. Same with Morocco, and Morocco used the German law, the NetzDG, as an inspiration. They called it an international best practice. But luckily, civil society were quick to react, and that bill was tabled, or that draft was tabled. So I would say there might be a resurfacing of these kind of laws soon, but so far, and luckily, we haven't seen any new, let's say, proposals being discussed by governments in the region.
Got it. A couple of other really great questions in the chat. One from Faraz Ansari, who asks, do you think that the future of these internet platforms after different regional regulations, for example, the GDPR, will be more fractured and insular? And will that help or hurt these content moderation issues?
Oof, that's a difficult question.
That's a big question.
Yeah. Well, I think, okay, so here's my humble opinion. Surely the era of self-regulation is coming to an end soon. And the question here is, how would the new regulation look like? And there's a lot of debate right now in the US, for example, on Section 230. I'm not an American, I'm not a US law expert on this issue, but there are these debates happening and lots of proposals popping right, left, and center. And similarly with in the EU with their Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And so I think those are an indication of attempts or trying to find solutions to these huge platforms that so far have enjoyed a great deal of unquestionable power. So it really depends at the end of the day of how those regulations look like. And from a regional perspective, even though those regulations, meaning the regulations taking place in the EU, at the EU level, or at certain national European level, or at the US, they're often drafted, discussed, and enacted without thinking that whatever legislation takes place there will have implications on the global south, either because the platforms themselves are based in the US and are governed by US law. So whatever is decided there will have direct impact on users that are outside of the US but use those platforms. Or because governments really, as I said, copy paste some of those legislations. And when it comes from democracies like the US and European countries, they're often seen as an international best practice or an international standard. And some regulation really works well in a democratic setting, but if you export that to an authoritarian context, it really does not work. So when we talk about co-regulation or government regulation of content, it might work in a country like Germany. NetzDG, there was a lot of public outcry that it can be detrimental to human rights and freedom of expression. But to a certain degree, it worked well because there are checks and balances, and the chance to exploit those kind of laws is slim. But if you have a similar law like NetzDG in Saudi Arabia, where certain content is flagged as illegal, first of all, who decides? In those kind of authoritarian contexts, illegal content can be legitimate speech, but it's illegal in that particular country. And so companies had to comply, and that would be really, really catastrophic. And so the question here is that, of course, how to find the right regulation, but to think in a global perspective, it's really, really important in those conversations and as governments and lawmakers trying to figure out ways forward.
Thank you, Marwa. There are some other really great questions in the chat that I wish we had time for, but we're right at the end of our hour. So I think we'll have to leave our conversation there. But thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us. This was really, really interesting. And I think it's given everybody a ton of food for thought about content moderation and, what is next for platform regulation. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us. This is the second of 5 events in this series on global digital rights challenges. Our next event is going to be in 2 weeks on Thursday, July 15th at 10 a.m. And in that session, we're going to be talking with Tomiwa Ilori from the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria and the Global Network Initiative. And that conversation is going to be about the impacts of internet shutdowns. So that's also going to be a really interesting, timely conversation. So I really encourage you to please tune in for that one as well. But please join me in thanking Marwa for her time today and for all of this excellent information that you were able to share with us based on your work at Access Now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.